What child is this who lay to rest on Mary's lap is sleeping, whom angels greet with anthems sweet, while shepherds watch are keeping?
We're going to continue on with what we started last week in part 2. Self-abnegation, the sin of self-abnegation in the modern church. And that word abnegation just simply means refuse to, or the refusing yourself. In other words, like self-sacrifice. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, we see this, as I mentioned last week, and with parents, with their children, or people in the battlefield and so forth. They sacrifice themselves for the good of someone else. But like everything else, it can have a negative side to it too. And we're looking at the sin of self-abnegation, because it can be sinful if it's misapplied or used wrongly. Now, our context we read last week was in John. We won't read the whole thing, but chapter 10, we'll begin at verse 13 instead of at verse 1 this time. It says in verse 13, "The hireling fleeth because he is a hireling, and careth not for the sheep. I am the good shepherd," Jesus says, "and I know my sheep, and I am known of mine. As the Father knoweth me, even so know I the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep." Now, I want to say that we think of this hireling being like an evil person, but he's really not necessarily a bad person. He's just hired. He's hired to do a job, and he's hired to guard these sheep. The difference Christ is pointing out is that he don't really love the sheep. He's there for the paycheck. He's there for the pay. It doesn't necessarily mean he's a bad person. It doesn't mean he's going to hurt the sheep purposely. It doesn't mean he can go there with a whip and whip the sheep. He's just there to take care of the sheep. And if nothing goes wrong, if everything's fine, then he will take care of the sheep properly. But if the wolf comes, well, if it gets tough, then the hireling, well, hey, he's getting serious now, so he takes off. He's gone. And so that's what we're looking at here. Sometimes people look at false shepherds and say, well, he looks like a good person. He's a nice person. Well, he probably is a nice person. He probably is a good person. He probably basically honest, good person in our community, in our society, and so on. But he's there for the paycheck. Now, he may not say that. In John 21:14, Jesus says to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these?" He says, "Yea, Lord, thou knowest I love thee." He said unto him, "Feed my lamb." And then he went on and said twice more, he said, asked the same question, "Do you love me?" And Peter said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Feed my sheep." And then he did it the third time. He said, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter said, "Yes." And he said, "Feed my sheep." And that's what we're looking at, these sheep of God. And generally we are told, or we're certainly given the impression, but I think we're more often told, that these sheep represent Christians. And Christian people, when you become a Christian, you become part of God's sheep. But we have seen from last week that the sheep is Israel. Israel is God's sheep. And these are the people Christ gave himself for. He gave himself for the sheep. And he sends shepherds who care for the sheep. The sheep is Israel. Now, that doesn't mean we have hatred towards other races. People are not Israel. It doesn't mean that. And I know that's the first thing people are going to say. You say, well, Israel is God's people.